Hello, and welcome to the Mind-Body-God Connection. Today, our topic is Alzheimer's disease. This is a sad, horrible disease, and it has a debilitating effect on patients. It is the most common neurological disorder in the United States, and it has many faces. The impact of Alzheimer's, which I will call AD, on patients is devastating. It affects not only patients but the caregivers, as was the case of the husband of Augusta D. Augusta D was the first documented case of Alzheimer's disease. In the 1880s, she married Carl Detter. She was in her 30s at that time. They lived what appeared to be a normal life. She was a housewife, he worked for the railroad, and they had one daughter. Well, beginning in the late 1890s, Augusta started to have a mental decline. Carl noticed that something was horribly wrong with his wife. She could not remember events that had occurred that day, and she had problems sleeping. Well, this decline continued. She became delusional, exhibited bizarre behaviors, and at night she would scream for hours, walking around the house dragging the sheets from her bed. Well, over a period of time, Carl had become worn out. He could no longer deal with the sleepless nights, the loss of income, and he had no other support. So, unfortunately, he had to make a choice, and that was to have her committed. In 1901, Augusta D was admitted to the Frankfort mental institution. She was 51 years old. But Augusta was not a mental patient. She had what we will learn is Alzheimer's disease. The doctor that examined her was Dr. Alzheimer's, where we get the name. Upon examination, he found that she had memory loss, she was agitated, she was having auditory hallucinations, and was extremely paranoid. During the examination, he asked her several questions. "What is your name?" She replied, "Auguste." "What is your husband's name?" She replied, "Auguste, I think." "Are you married?" "Yes, to Auguste." And then she said these 4 infamous words, "I have lost myself." Indeed, Augusta D had lost herself. She died at the age of 56 in a mental institution from the complications of Alzheimer's disease. AD attacks the brain, and it slowly robs the individual of his or her individuality. Now, with advances in medical technology, we are living much longer, and baby boomers undoubtedly will live to a ripe old age. The longer you live, the greater your chance of developing this horrific disease. Are you at risk? During this lecture, we will look at the risk factors and see how we can minimize some of the factors that cause Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's is the 7th leading cause of death in the United States, and currently it affects 5 million Americans. It is predicted by the year 2050 that this number will triple. So, what is Alzheimer's disease? It is a gradual but progressive decline in mental ability, and this decline occurs over a period of 10 to 20 years. There are many stages of this disease. Stage 1 is the early stage, stage 2, moderate, and late is the 3rd stage. But before we explore this disease, first, let's look at normal memory and how it functions. Memory has several components. There's long-term memory, and working memory, which is short-term. Long-term memory is called episodic memory. It is the recall of events from previous life experiences. For example, your high school prom, graduation, your first date, or that first car. These are all episodes that make up memory. There is semantic memory. This is knowledge of facts and figures, the knowledge of when you bought your car and the cost of that car, the date you graduated from high school. And then there's procedural memory. This is the unconscious learning through repetition. For example, learning to play a musical instrument, riding a bike, or driving a car. I remember my first experience with driving. I was 15 at the age and I learned on automatic, which is really easy. But when I was in my 20s, I wanted a stick shift. There was this sport car that I really liked, but I didn't know how to drive a stick shift. And it was funny, my brother picked up the car and then later I learned to drive. Well, this was very difficult, especially trying to maneuver the clutch and the brake. But once I was able to get that in my brain from repetitive driving, it's there. And so now when I drive a stick shift, it just comes back automatically. Short-term memory. That is the ability to remember information over a short period of time. Phone numbers, names, and this occurs within seconds to minutes, and it can be stored for a couple of hours. Information is then transferred to the hippocampus, and this is one of the most important parts of the brain. This is where learning and memory is stored. The hippocampus is located in the temporal lobe, and as I said, it's involved in learning and memory. It transfers this information to the cerebral cortex, the part of the brain that involves memory, alertness, language, thought, and then it becomes consolidated into long-term memory, which becomes a permanent record. Alzheimer's patients cannot remember what happened hours, minutes, or even seconds ago, but they can recall events that occurred decades ago. Why is this? Let's say, for an example, you ask a patient who had stage 2 or 3, and it depends upon the stage. If you ask them, who is the President of the United States? And they might not be able to recall the current president. However, if you ask them, who's the 17th President of the United States? Without hesitancy, they can recall. This is because the hippocampus, which is memory formation, has been damaged and new memory cannot be laid down. Unfortunately, as this disease progresses, the permanent memory will also be destroyed. Let's look at the early stage of AD. Usually during this first stage, we see memory loss. Some of the symptoms are that a patient will be unable to recall recent events, unable to name common items, have trouble handling money and paying their bills. We might see depression, anxiety. Oftentimes the patient will get lost and misplace items. Now, you might be saying, wait a minute, that sounds like me. Well, this is considered normal aging, age-associated memory. For example, this has happened to me on many occasions. You know, I'm rushing out the door and I can't find my keys. And I'm tearing up my house trying to find those keys. And I put my hand down on my pockets and find that it's right there. Or maybe you're wearing your glasses and you walk by the mirror and you see that you're wearing your glasses. This is considered normal aging, and it occurs between the ages of 40 and 50. So what's happening during this time? We begin to lose brain cells, which are called neurons. But fortunately, we have what's going on in the brain, a process called neurogenesis. And this is the generation of new nerve cells in a few areas of the brain. But this does not occur in patients with Alzheimer's disease. In the moderate stage of AD, we see increased memory loss. Patients begin to forget how to do certain activities that they've done forever, such as taking a bath, brushing their teeth. Oftentimes there is language impairment. Now, it is especially sad for patients. This is especially sad for patients, but the loved ones are also suffering during this time. I have experienced this both as a nurse and as a family member. My maternal grandmother, who was once a beautiful, talented, gifted woman who was very active and energetic all of her life, she was diagnosed with AD in her 80s. During this stage, we often see hallucinations, aggressive behaviors, increased sexuality, and difficulty performing routine chores. Oftentimes, patients will wonder, and they develop a syndrome called sundown syndrome, where they wake up in the middle of the night and just wonder, and oftentimes are lost. During this time, with increased memory loss and confusion, hand-eye coordination is really bad. And many Alzheimer's patients want to continue to drive, but because of the impaired memory, the lack of coordination, it is very dangerous to be behind the wheel. The advanced stage reveals this relentless hold and the progression of the brain-destroying disease. Now, my once mentally sharp, active, outgoing grandmother, who had called my name perhaps hundreds of thousands of times, now during this stage, she looked at me on many occasions and asked, "Who are you? What is your name?" For me, this was most heartbreaking. As the disease progresses, we see severe language impairment, the inability, as I said, to recognize family members. Patients will also lose function of their bowels and their bladder, as well as walking and learning and dressing themselves. Near the end of the stage of AD, there is complete loss of memory, and many patients become bedridden. So what are the causes of AD? Well, 10% of the causes are related to genetics, but the other 90%, the cause is unknown. Is there a possible mind-body connection? Well, we will definitely explore this, but first let's take a look at the pathology of this disease and also look at the areas of the brain that are affected. Decades before the first symptom appears, quietly and methodically, patients' brain cells are being destroyed. Now, you may recall that in earlier lectures we discussed the neurons, the nerve cells, and the different lobes of the brain. So I'm going to just give a brief review of the anatomy of the brain, and this will clearly demonstrate the areas that the path of destruction occurs that leads to AD. We have 100 billion nerve cells in the brain, making 100 trillion synapses. These are the brain's building blocks. Each nerve cell is made up of a dendrite, a cell body, and an axon. We also have supporting cells, which are called glia cells and astrocytes. The astrocytes and the glia cells, they provide a structure for the brain cells. It provides a blood-brain barrier to keep foreign substances out, kills bacteria, removes dead nerve cells, and makes repairs and provides oxygen and nutrients to the brain. There are also 4 lobes of the brain: the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And we also have the limbic system, which is the site of emotional regulation. At any given time, hundreds of thousands of bits of information travel with lightning speed as electrical impulses on our nerve cells. It is here on the neurons that our thoughts and memories are formed and stored. Chemicals are released and messages are sent to all parts of the brain. It is also here on the neurons that this insidious assault of Alzheimer's begins and will eventually cause massive destruction throughout the entire brain. So let's look at the hallmarks of AD. We see what is called beta amyloid plaques, neurofibrillary tangles, and loss of connections. This is exactly what Dr. Alzheimer saw when he did an autopsy on Augusta D. There was massive destruction occurring in her brain. So what is amyloid plaque? It's a protein, a normal protein produced in the body. However, it becomes abnormal. Somehow it changes and accumulates in the brain between cells. It causes fragments of proteins to clump together and they form plaque. And this plaque is what destroys the brain cells. The other problem is the neurofibrillary tangles. It is also a protein called Tau, but it becomes abnormal also. Tau provides structure to the cells, but then it starts to twist and tangle, causing death of the brain cells. We see that the brain begins to atrophy. On this slide, you see a normal brain and a brain that has Alzheimer's disease. The brain on the left is normal, and it's much bigger than the brain on the right. As you can see, the brain on the right has atrophied. When this happens, healthy brain cells are prevented from making connections. They lose their ability to communicate, and the nerve cell dies. It is estimated that thousands of nerve cells die on a regular basis every day. And this occurs over a period of 10 to 20 years. What about the age of onset? There are two stages, early onset and late onset. Early onset begins before the age of 65 and late onset after 65. Your risk for developing AD increases with age. Early set, before the age of 65, the risk is 1 in 8. And after the age of 85, the risk increases to 1 in 2. There are many areas of the brain affected. The first site is the temporal lobe, which houses the entorhinal cortex and hippocampus. They're both involved in learning and memory. Then there's the amygdala, which is also in the temporal lobe. It is part of the limbic system, and this accounts for the violent behaviors and mood swings in patients with AD. As this disease progresses, other areas of the brain are involved, and eventually, as the disease worsens, we will see widespread erosion of the brain. Something that happens later in this disease is the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. And when this happens, it allows for the entrance of metals such as aluminum. It has been found on autopsy that patients with Alzheimer's have up to 30 times more aluminum in their brain. Is there a mind-body connection with AD? What is the role of stress on the brain? Let's take a look. Stress kicks into gear the HPA axis. It triggers the release of glucocorticoids, which is cortisol, another name for cortisol. And this enters into the bloodstream. High levels of cortisol kills brain cells. A study done by Dr. Robert Sapolsky, a neurologist at Stanford University, states in his book, "Finally, there is evidence that truly prolonged exposure to stress or glucocorticoids can actually kill hippocampal neurons." He goes on to state in his book that researchers in the 1960s gave guinea pigs synthetic glucocorticoids, and they gave them a dose which was higher than the normal that the body would make. They discovered that pharmacy-grade levels of glucocorticoids caused damage to the hippocampus. Well, then Sapolsky did his own research back in 1980s. And in his studies, he states that toxicity to the nerve cells from glucocorticoids, cortisol, occurs not only from pharmacy-grade cortisol, but from cortisol produced by the body during stress, and that this stress accelerates the degeneration of the hippocampus. There is a mind-body connection. Stress affects not only the mind, but the body. It causes havoc on the nerve cells. In animal studies, mice were genetically engineered to have AD. They were given synthetic cortisol, and after 1 week, these mice had a 60% increase in beta amyloid proteins as compared to mice of the same age who were not given a drug. Studies were also done on 13-month-old mice who had existing plaque, and their lesions became worse when given the synthetic cortisol. We know that stress increases our risk for Alzheimer's disease, but what are some of the other causes of Alzheimer's? There are some things that we can change, and there are some things that we can't. So let's look at some of our other risk factors. Well, aging. We can't change our age. We can't change our genes. There are certain genes. There is a gene called APOE4 gene, and it is often found to be related to the development of Alzheimer's. Lifestyle, smoking, sleep deprivation, stress. Also, a diet that is high in fat, high in calories, a diet that is low in fruits and vegetables also puts an individual more at risk for the development of AD. Low leptin levels. And leptin is a hormone that regulates our appetite. Research shows that when leptin levels are low, that individuals have a high tendency to develop Alzheimer's disease. And this is because the hormone leptin removes amyloid plaque. Head trauma also increases the risk for beta amyloid proteins. Medical conditions such as atherosclerosis, hypertension, diabetes, depression, high LDL cholesterol levels, obesity, and stroke, they all increase the risk for developing AD. Now, we can protect our brain, and at the top of the list is lifestyle, which starts with a healthy diet. Healthy foods fight free radical damage. A healthy diet slows down the ravaging effects of the free radicals on the body. As we know, free radicals accelerates the normal aging, and it is the cause of many diseases, including AD. Free radical damage is free radicals damage our genetic blueprint, the DNA. But a plant-based diet with whole grains, fruits, and vegetables provides nutrients that are high in antioxidants, and they prevent free radical damage. These foods are loaded with vitamin C, vitamin E, omega-3 fatty acids, among other nutrients. What about the role of physical and mental activities? Studies show that intellectual engaging activities decrease the risk for the development of dementia, which is a form of Alzheimer's disease. It reduces the damage to neurons from toxic substance in the environment, and it has a protective effect on the hippocampus, and the benefits can last up to 3 days. Pre-existing diseases such as hypertension, diabetes, atherosclerosis, depression, elevated cholesterol levels also increase the risk for AD. Steps taken to protect the brain, such as diet and exercise, also protect against lifestyle-related diseases. A study was done by Dr. Snowdon. It was called the NUN study. It started back in 1986, and it researched the neuropathology of Alzheimer's disease. He had 678 participants. They were all nuns, ages 75 to 106. He evaluated their lifestyle, lifestyles, which included their diet, exercise, mental function, and social and religious practices. He found that these nuns had healthier diets, that they exercised, lived in a cognitively enriched environment, they didn't smoke, and they had social support. They practiced their religious convictions. These nuns also donated their brains to science, and upon autopsy, it was found that many of the nuns had brain lesions similar to Alzheimer's disease. They had the plaque and they had the tangles, but they never developed the disease. The reason is because they did not have any other diseases. What is the take-home message? The take-home message is that if we eat right, exercise, we can prevent disease. I want you to take this challenge. Look at your risk factors and start today making positive lifestyle changes that will not only enhance your brain function, but improve the overall quality of your health. Until next time.
Is there a connection between what we think and how we feel? Does the mind talk to the body and the body to the mind? Does this communication affect our spiritual walk? In her new book, Mind, Body, God Connection, Darlene D. Hall explores the links between the mind and the body and its development of disease. Mind, Body, God Connection is available at Barnes & Noble, on Amazon.com, and Christian bookstores nationwide. Mind, Body, God Connection by Darlene D. Hall.